Well, hello to everybody joining us on a live, well, I guess you're not joining us, but who's watching now on the recorded version. And I feel like I almost know what I'm doing. I haven't skipped hitting record in a few weeks. We will be a shocker, but we did not get very far in Matthew last week.
What?
For those of you who've missed a few weeks, you've missed a lot of discussion, but you haven't missed a lot of text. I think, unless someone tells me I'm wrong, that we are now in Matthew, still in Matthew 26, because there's a lot going on in there, and we're up to verse 47.
Mm-hmm.
And we are having betrayal, arrest of Jesus, Jesus's trial, Peter's denial. So some sort of dark passages maybe today. Would anybody like to read verses 47 through 56?
I'll read.
All right, thank you, Tom.
While he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, arrived, accompanied by a large crowd with swords and clubs, who had come from the chief priests and the elders of the people. His betrayer had arranged a sign with them saying, "The man I shall kiss is the one. Arrest him." Immediately he went over to Jesus and said, "Hail, Rabbi," and he kissed him. Jesus answered him, "Friend, do what you have come for." Then stepping forward, they laid hands on Jesus and arrested him. And behold, one of those who accompanied Jesus put his hand to his sword, drew it, and struck the high priest's servant, cutting off his ear. Then Jesus said to him, "Put your sword back into its sheath, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword. Do you think that I cannot call upon my Father, and he will not provide me at this moment with more than 12 legions of angels? But then, how would the scriptures be fulfilled, which say that it must come to pass in this way?" At that hour, Jesus said to the crowds, "Have you come out as against a robber with swords and clubs to seize me? Day after day I sat teaching in the temple area, yet you did not arrest me. But all this has come to pass, that the writings of the prophets may be fulfilled." Then all the disciples left him and fled.
Thank you.
Okay, the one thing that really strikes me in this is that if the person that cut off the Roman servant's ear was one of his apostles, why was he carrying a sword? I wouldn't think any of the apostles would be carrying.
I think most people probably did because of all of the highway robbers and.
Well, that's probably true.
You know, there were murderous people about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In one of the other gospels, I can't remember, I think it's Luke, it talks about Jesus. There was a passage where Jesus was saying that they should sell their cloak and buy a sword, and two of the disciples said, "Well, anyway," they said, "Yeah, we have two." And Jesus' response, "Yeah, we have two." They already had two. And Jesus' response was, "It is enough." And this particular passage here in the Luke passage are used a lot in the gun control debate among Christians. Whether the argument is, why did Jesus told them to buy a sword, so they equate it with having a gun. And then it goes back and forth. And then this particular passage is often quoted, and sometimes by the primitive Christian church, as showing that Jesus, when he disarmed Peter, disarmed all Christians everywhere for all time. And so, yeah, there's a lot here in terms of the argument for pacifism and, violence, carrying weapons, things like that. So what you say, Carol, is a really good observation. that, where the sword comes from, but then you look at Jesus' response. So I don't want to belabor all those points, except just since you brought it up, just to point those issues out, that a lot, there's, since we're not dealing with the other passages, we don't have to deal with the passage where Jesus tells them to go sell a cloak and buy a sword, what that might mean, whether it was an actual physical sword or whether it was representative, or, there's a lot of different ways of looking at that. But that is a really interesting situation. But Jesus here, he made a very strong statement, at least to me, that, if you pick up the sword, you're going to die by the sword. And I think he's just stating what I think is an obvious conclusion, and that is violence begets violence, always. Yeah. Violence never is a good solution. And I think it's something we need to really consider in the context of our world, in the context of some of the things that are happening right now, that we need to consider what the Christian's role in these situations where there's a lot of violence and there's a lot of violence being committed against people, and what is the church, what is the Christian's response? What can we do in these situations to bring about healing, instead of exacerbating the situation by necessarily taking sides on one side or the other and saying, well, this justifies this. As one of the persons I read a lot spoke about, is particular in the situation of the Jews and the Palestinians, that if you look at what's going on there, you can understand these various occurrences and these historical contexts can explain to us what happened. That doesn't necessarily mean it justifies it. So, that it's a complex issue when you're dealing with a violent world. But then I think, for me at least, it's a question of what is my response as a Christian, as a follower of Jesus, to these violent situations? What can I do? And I can't. I have a problem with violence. Out of my time in the military and my time studying after that, I think that very rarely does violence get fixed by being better at violence or more violent. I think it's just a cycle that just continually escalates.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, thank
Yeah.
you, David. I'm always interested too, because I know you and Leslie both serve in the military, like the perspective of people, because I know there are people who struggle with their faith, but also want to serve their country.
Mhm.
And I think about that a lot. And we talk about violence being justified. I think you can make an argument here that, is this Peter then who's taking the sword?
Yeah,
Okay.
it says so. It says so in another gospel.
I think you could say Peter's justified in defending Jesus. He's being seized in an unjust way. He knows that he hasn't committed crimes. He wants to defend him from this, like, if not unlawful, at least immoral use of the state for violence. Then Jesus is like, it's not whether it's justified or not. Like, it's just we're not going to live like that. So that's pretty powerful. Do other people have thoughts?
Yeah, what really struck me was the very final sentence. Then all the disciples deserted him and fled. I've thought, from time to time over the years that it's kind of comforting that people we consider to be saints, or people who actually lived and breathed with Jesus, could show so much humanity in ways that we all too often do ourselves. Weaknesses and lack of trust and all that kind of thing.
And fear.
And fear.
Yeah.
Fear is a great motivator. I'm sure that had you asked these people just hours before, they would have all been boastful like Peter.
Yeah.
At least to some degree, I will stand with you till the end, that kind of thing. But in fact, they all fled. And, I must say, I'd probably flee too, if I had an angry mob that was armed with clubs and swords,
Well, and if you can't fight back, Like, I mean, if they're like, okay, I know how to do this, like I can like hit somebody with my sword, and he's like, don't do that. And you're like, what else do I know? Fight or flight, right? If I can't
Right.
fight, like I better flee.
Right.
It's
I think,
just,
yeah, I really like that, Greg, and I heard it put this way, kind of simply, that Peter and the other disciples, they were willing to kill for Jesus, but they weren't willing to die for him.
See, now that
That is
is
profound.
astute, yes.
yeah, I love that.
Yeah, very much.
It's sorry, this is like out of context. It reminds me of Hamilton, that thing where he's like living is easy, young man, or dying is easy, young man, living is harder. He's like, I don't want you to go and fight. I want you to live and problem solve. And in the musical Hamilton fights against that. Like, no, I want to go out and battle. Like, I know how to do that. That's really astute, David. I love that.
Mhm.
And yet if it hadn't been for their fear and their running away, they might have been rounded up and taken off with Jesus. And that's where Christianity might have died if they all
That's what
got
I was
killed.
thinking. That's what I was thinking exactly.
Live to fight another day.
Yeah,
Not much. No one left to spread the gospel if they all died with him.
yeah.
Yeah, true.
I want to go back, and I don't have any deep thoughts on it, but just the symbolism of being betrayed with the kiss, like it permeates. I'm thinking of like mob movies and things, but this idea that I'm going to kiss him, and then I don't know if there's a historical reason for that. I feel like you could write a whole thesis on this idea that that's how you betrayed somebody.
Mhm.
And whether it's just there as a story device to really emphasize he's betrayed from inside,
Mhm.
or if there's more going on. Does anyone, have you ever read anything or thought
No.
about that?
No, but it's almost like a double betrayal in a way then, because, perhaps the kiss was a way of greeting each other. I mean, we still do the kiss of peace. We don't really, but they call it the kiss of peace. And just a reminder that Judas had loved Jesus,
Yeah,
and that was a mutual thing. So to use a kiss, it almost seemed like a little stab in the back as well as a betrayal.
it's cold,
Yeah,
right? It's
yeah.
not a, like in like going back to old English common law, there's like this hot blood murder versus cold murder, and we still have that. We've carried that on to like different degrees of how culpable you think someone is or what the punishment should be.
Mhm.
And this idea that I'm betraying you, I'm gonna say I'm gonna do it, and then I'm gonna do it as an act of affection, makes it feel so premeditated and
Makes the betrayal very personal.
right, intimate.
Rather than Judas standing back and saying, that's him right there in the purple robe or whatever, but
Also,
it's almost like,
because they would have known who he was.
it's
He's
almost
not
like
Right.
Judas was, hugging him and kind of saying, I've been telling you what I want you to do and you're not doing it, so this is what you get. But I don't
Wow.
think Judas realized exactly what he was doing. I don't think otherwise he wouldn't have killed himself. He was so remorseful in the
Right.
end.
Yeah, it's
I think it's kind. No, go ahead, please.
no, I was just gonna say, like, I sometimes feel like I need to echo Greg here. He would say it's very cinematic. Like, it's beautiful. You can see the plot unfolding, and it's
Mhm.
like a very theatrical kind
Yeah.
of scene that they've set. But go ahead, David.
I was just gonna say it's like a double betrayal. He did this as if he were, still one of his disciples, loved to take Jesus unawares and probably make it easier to take him. It's just this is just the ultimate in using his relationship with Jesus to betray him more easily. It's just
Yeah, hurtful.
And yet it's almost kind of, I don't know how to say it. It's kind of ironic because you would think, why would anybody need to identify Jesus? Jesus was so well known.
Yeah,
So why would there even have to be somebody betraying him? They
Right.
would know who he was.
Yeah.
So
Well-
it makes it ironic in the whole end of it.
well, it's easy to say in our age where we've got mass communication, you know, and we've got newspapers and we've got all these
Right.
things. Of course, we recognize exactly what someone looks like that's a leader. Back then, they didn't have this. So although these Roman soldiers knew Jesus by reputation, it's not that likely that many knew what he actually looked like. They, you know, they might have made a mistake and, you know, gone to the
Right.
wrong person. But I would say too that the situation with the apostles is I think they were totally surprised. It seems odd to us to think this. Maybe even Judas was surprised. What happened? Because I think although Jesus had given them plenty of hints, they still didn't quite get they hadn't got the memo. They didn't realize that Jesus was really going to die. They thought that he was going to be a Messiah like David, a conquering Messiah. That's what they wanted. Maybe, and Judas, I've heard it argued at least that he was trying to stimulate Jesus into actually doing something, to making his move, and he didn't. And here it is. Jesus is being arrested. He's not allowing them to resist. And they were just dumbfounded. They were terrified. They weren't psychologically prepared for this. They just fled because you know, this was not something they had ever really considered. You know, really considered, in spite of all Jesus had said.
He didn't even hint, didn't he just come right out and say, I'm gonna be gone, I'm gonna leave you, I'm leaving you. So, yeah.
Well, should we go on? We know how
Sure.
the story's gonna unfold, but
Mhm.
they certainly did not. Let's see, maybe 57 to 68. Jesus before the high priest. Anybody want to read that?
Here, I'll read it.
Oh,
Nobody
thank
else
you.
will. Sure. Those who had apprehended Jesus led him off to Caiaphas the high priest, where the scribes and elders were convened. Peter kept following him at a distance as far as the high priest's residence. Going inside, he sat down with the guards to see the outcome. The chief priests, with the whole Sanhedrin, were busy trying to obtain false testimony against Jesus so that they might put him to death. They discovered none, despite the many false witnesses who took the stand. Finally, two came forward who stated, "This man has declared, I can destroy God's sanctuary and rebuild it in 3 days." The high priest rose to his feet and addressed him. "Have you no answer to the testimony leveled against you?" But Jesus remained silent. The high priest then said to him, "I order you to tell us under oath before the living God whether you are the Messiah, the Son of God." Jesus answered, "It is you who say it, but I tell you this. Soon you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of the power and coming on the clouds of heaven." At this, the high priest tore his robes. "He has blasphemed. What further need have we of witnesses? Remember, you heard the blasphemy. What is your verdict?" They answered, "He deserves death." Then they began to spit in his face and hit him. Others slapped him, saying, "Play the prophet for us, Messiah. Who struck you?"
Wow. He's not really mustering a rigorous defense.
Well,
Makes me still wonder if we'll recognize him when he comes again, and what will we try and do to him then?
Yeah.
Well, I find it that when he said, soon you will see the Son of Man coming on a cloud, that they immediately thought he was saying, it's me, I'm coming back on a cloud.
Mhm.
He didn't say me, he said the Son of Man, although I know he did refer to himself as the Son of Man often, but he didn't, and he never really comes out and says, yes, I'm the Messiah. He always puts it back on them. You said it, not me.
Yeah, it's
And he said that a couple times to his disciples too.
yeah, it's a confusing strategy
mhm.
because he's not just saying, yes, I am the Son of Man. I'm here.
Mhm.
Listen to me. Here's 5 things to know.
In,
And it's, yeah, go ahead, David.
I was just going to say, in order to convict someone of treason, in order to have them condemned to death at that time, you had to have 2 witnesses agree word for word. Just so to understand the context of what's going on there, whether we're talking about having they kept having witnesses, but they couldn't agree word for word. And then they finally got two that were able to agree pretty much word for word and establish a basis for him to be condemned.
Do we just
So-
keep, go ahead.
No, go right ahead.
No, it's just a dark passage. Maybe we just keep trudging through and then we have,
Although I have a bit of a comment on it.
yeah, please do, Don.
Well, he kind of did tear down the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. That's Easter.
Yeah,
Yes,
He
very good
changed
insight.
everything.
That's exactly right. You're exactly right. That's what Matthew's getting at here. Yeah, absolutely.
I don't think these people back then were trained to think in that kind of terms, though, as metaphorically or whatever that is, where,
Yeah.
you know, rather than they were talking about the temple, the Solomon's temple, that's what he was saying. And he
I
wasn't referring to that at all.
I think you're right, Carol. They didn't get it. I do think they were taught to think that way. You know, they understood metaphor. You know, they weren't not that primitive. It's not like they were so primitive that, you know, we can look at as sophisticated people today and turn back at look at this and say, whoa, you know, they just didn't get it. They didn't think, you know, that rationally. They did understand. It's just they didn't get this in particularly right there. And they had an agenda and they finally accomplished it. And then that was, you know, if Jesus said that, misunderstanding that he was talking about himself, but still those words were blasphemy to them, you know. And I'm not sure it was quite sufficient grounds for the Romans, but it certainly was grounds for the Jews to send him to the Romans to say, well, we need to crucify him. See, you probably understand that the Jews, as a conquered people, they didn't have a right to condemn people to death. They couldn't do that. That's why they had to take him to Pilate, because Rome wasn't having any of that. They couldn't get it. You know, they weren't allowing religious groups to begin, crucifying or killing one another based on their religious convictions. There had to be a reason that was valid for Rome.
So how was it that Herod was able to behead John the Baptist?
Herod was appointed by Rome, the king.
Okay, so he was
He
doing
wasn't
it.
he wasn't a religious authority. You're going to see that's what they do. I'm not sure, and I didn't read ahead. I'm not sure if that's what happens in Matthew, but the next stop for Jesus is not Pilate, it's Herod.
Right.
And Herod was afraid to pull the trigger. Yeah, so.
but Caiaphas can't kill him.
Okay.
No, he's the high priest, and he does not have that authority.
But he can refer him on, right?
Yeah.
But Herod could have condemned him to death if he had wanted to. Okay.
He was the king of that area that had been, validated by Rome. Pilate was a special governor that came because of all the unrest that had been going on in the area. So Pilate was there, and he was there specifically because of the fear of trouble, because of everything that had been going on with Jesus and everything. So he came there, and he's there primarily to ensure peace, because one thing the Romans would not put up with was riots. They called them tumults, but they wouldn't put up with riots. And Pilate was there to make very sure that there were no uprisings, no riots. That was his job.
Okay.
Right, because in other parts of the Roman world, the Roman army came down swiftly and viciously whenever there were people who were trying to fight back.
Yeah, I find myself having pictures of like the British in India,
Mm-hmm.
right? India can like govern itself like a little bit, and they would have local things, but if anything was going wrong, they would send a British soldier, and it would be, I don't know if you've read any of Gandhi's biography, but like viciously like put down any kind of organization. I kind of think of Pilate that way in my own head. But
And unfortunately, I'm thinking of what's going on over in the Middle East as well, when you think about it.
yeah. Well, unrest is not new, unfortunately.
No, I don't think. My
If-
grandfather said once, there will be a war for everyone's generation,
Mm.
you know?
Yeah, one of my social studies teachers said that about every 20 years, there has to be a war, another to boost people's economies, for one thing.
It does. Really, there's a lot of profit to be made in a war.
Were you gonna say something else, David? Oh, you're muted.
He shook his head.
Oh,
So,
okay, we're good.
yeah,
So let's try to finish 26. Unless someone else wants to jump in, I'll read 69 to 75.
sounds good.
Okay. Says Peter's denial of Jesus. Says, now Peter was sitting outside in the courtyard. A servant girl came to him and said, you also were with Jesus the Galilean. But he denied it before all of them, saying, I do not know what you're talking about. When he went out to the porch, another servant girl saw him, and she said to the bystanders, this man was with Jesus of Nazareth. Again, he denied it with an oath. I do not know the man. After a little while, the bystanders came up and said to Peter, certainly you are also one of them, for your accent betrays you. Then he began to curse and he swore an oath. I do not know the man. At that moment, the cock crowed. Then Peter remembered what Jesus had said, before the cock crows, you will deny me 3 times. And he went out and wept bitterly.
Hmm.
If there's a better summary of what people are like, I don't know it. Good intentions, paving the road to hell and all that.
Yeah. Well, at least you
Still
can,
the same thing David said, willing to live for him, but not die for him.
But again, I
Because,
think-
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I just think that this is maybe the ultimate example of the fact that the disciples probably, regardless of what had been said, did they really think that Jesus was gonna be tortured and killed? You know, they probably felt, you know, he had to face trial and maybe they release him or slap him on the wrist or put him
Put him
in
in
jail
prison,
for
yeah.
a while, like they did to John the Baptist. But I don't think any of them really probably envisioned how horrifying it was actually going to end up being.
Well, if you'd seen him with your own eyes commit miracles,
Yes.
right? Okay, hey, I saw you walk on the ocean and I saw you like do all these things. Can you just like float away? Like, like hop on down, man. And like to watch it unfolding, you'd feel so confused and
Mhm.
just disoriented, I bet.
Yeah.
That the person who's done all these amazing things, you've been just like left your nets and followed, is now in jail.
Right. Right. And then it also strikes me after the fact, with the thousands of people that sometimes gathered and were, you know, embracing the message of Jesus and all that. Where really were the protests? Where were these people? Even during the whole walk to the cross and all that. I mean, I know the streets were supposed to be lined and all that, but you would have thought that there might have been some kind of
uprising right there.
kerfuffle, you know,
Yeah,
or at
Well-
least. Yeah, go ahead,
Yeah.
David.
No, I was just going to say, I think it goes back to this, that the disciples, the crowds, they all expected Jesus to do something, a certain something. When Jesus had made his triumphal entry, they
Mhm.
were all calling for him to be king, the Messiah, the king, Hosanna, you know, and they expected him to take over and lead them in a revolt against Rome. And the same thing happened with the disciples. You know, Peter, old hot-headed Peter, and the people that, you know, he was willing to fight for Jesus. But then when Jesus said, no, I'm submitting to this, put your sword down. And they couldn't understand it. It just made no sense to them. They had no context for it. They had no precedent for it. And they were just terrified. They said, what are we supposed to do? Just stand back and just go like a lamb to slaughter? That's what Jesus is doing. That's not what we expected. He was supposed to take over. He's supposed to be in charge. But Jesus was, of course, he was modeling a different way, a way of nonviolence, a way of service, even to the point of death for one's enemies. That was totally incomprehensible. They weren't ready. And so the context of what, what I was saying is, it's just a little whole psychologically, it's a different thing to be willing to fight and die, but it's another thing just to roll over and, just submit yourself to whatever they're going to do to you. So, yeah, it's
Maybe it was also Jesus' way of setting an example for us to submit to God's will, no matter what comes our way. We have to, ultimately say, your will be done.
But even I think it's a way of modeling the kind of behavior he wants us to engage in as his followers. If we're going to follow Jesus, we don't use the methods of power or violence or wealth or influence. No, we rule by service, even to your enemies. Willingness to serve, not to rule over. It's just a different kind of kingdom. It's an upside down kingdom from not even the standards of that world, but the standards of this world. The fact that the leaders of the followers of Jesus are not those who rule over others, but those who are most serving others, even the least of the least, and even your enemies. That's a kind of kingdom that's unheard of. That's a kind of kingdom we really need to concentrate on right now, I think.
Right. Well, you can kind of, considering the history, you can kind of understand the incredulity of the people. I mean, King David, warlike, murderous, the history of the Hebrews was not a pretty one. And they had that power, and again, David, I think you mentioned a couple weeks ago, and I've read this before too. There was this grandiose thing that, because the Hebrews considered themselves chosen by God, that they would dare to take on the Assyrians or the Babylonians or the Philistines, and Rome. Come on.
Yeah.
A little band of guerrillas could have done some damage to the few Roman soldiers that were stationed right there. But the might of Rome would have come down like a sledgehammer had they really acted on that. So
I think they understood that, but at that time, they believed that if they were God's people, that they were not fighting the fight, that God would fight the fight for them, using them in this way. And as a violent overthrow. If you take a look at the passage, they ask him if he's the Messiah. Well, Messiah literally means anointed one. It means one who is made king, and Messiah, the Messiah they expected, goes back to the kingship of David, the one who fought for them against the Philistines and the people there, and made them a great nation, at least for a time. And so that's what they were expecting. That's the kind of Messiah they were talking about. But Jesus, the kind of Messiah that Jesus modeled, was not like that at all. And so because of that, he lost the crowds. They weren't there. And then the other crowd the other crowds that were there they were either bought and paid for or incited by the Jewish authorities. Those were the ones at the crucifixion. But they just simply didn't understand. That's what they were. And Jesus, the Messiah, he was modeling, at least according to a lot of the Old Testament authors, it was the kind of a Messiah from Isaiah that talks about the suffering servant, the kind of king that suffers for his people. But that wasn't the model they understood or were looking for at all.
Is that why you think he prevaricated when he was talking to Caiaphas? He's like, are you the Messiah? And he's like, if you want to use that word, like if you want to think I'm David or anointed or I'm going to be king, like you can use that word, but I'm going to tell you the Son of Man will be in the clouds. Like he flips it a little, like whatever you think that word means that you're saying. And I'm not telling you no, but I don't think I'm the Messiah the way you think a Messiah should be. I'm wondering if that's why. I've never thought about it, David. Thank you. That's really.
Yeah. And I think also it's interesting to note that people ask Jesus hundreds of questions and he only answers like 3 times. He almost always answers a question with a further question. The mystical, the Jesus that really, instead of just giving you an answer, just answers in a different way that makes you think and makes you go deeper. And yeah, I think you extrapolated that very nicely, Charity. That's a good way of putting it all together. I really like that.
'Cause I've always wondered why he wasn't just like, yeah, I'm the Messiah, like,
Mhm.
like own it. And,
Yeah.
I mean, but and I wonder if it's just like, you don't even know what that word means, man. Like,
Right.
use the words you want to use.
Right.
It's
And
interesting.
there, as is true of all throughout the Bible, there are contradictions in the New Testament also, as far as I'm concerned. Just the issue of how aware was Jesus of who he was and what, because we say he's fully God and fully human, and that's like how
That's a lot to hold. Yeah.
Right. But if he really had the foreknowledge of God, then he really wasn't truly human. He just was God inside flesh.
Mhm.
So, and again, going back to the cinematic thing that we were used to, right?
Yeah.
How much of the screenplay was written after the movie was made?
Yeah.
I mean, how much of the screenplay is accurate? So, these, the people writing this, we have to remember that they were already zealous about their faith for whatever reasons. But I'm always going to be questioning how much of this is factually true and
Yeah.
how much is
Yeah.
encouragement to follow in this path.
Yeah, there's no contemporaneous writings.
Right.
Like, that's one thing, like in for evidence and for legal cases, like,
Right.
did someone take notes contemporaneously?
Right.
Because if you already know how it turns out, even if you're trying to just put the fact down, they're tainted by knowing what comes later. And in this, I mean, 100 years later
Right.
or longer,
Yeah.
they know lots of things that happened, but in that moment,
I think there was probably
Crazy.
one person that knew this was gonna end this way, and that was Mary, because she was always warned
Mhm.
from the time that she conceived him, that she was gonna die with the sword in her heart. So she probably knew this was not gonna end well.
I-
When
Yeah,
he
I-
was-
yes, not taking a
I'd
path
like
of.
to
Go
I'd
ahead.
like to go back real quickly. I'd like to go back to something that Greg said that I really think was insightful, in that on this side of the story, when we talk about Jesus being God and man, we tend to kind of have a skewed view of what that might mean. We want to emphasize the God over the man. It's kind of like I've heard an example of, we really view Jesus as Superman and Clark Kent.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
but
Frank's happy somewhere.
that's not a good example, though, because Superman, he's indestructible regardless, even when he puts those glasses on, so no one could possibly tell that Clark Kent is Superman. But
Right.
he's not. But Jesus is really, if you look at the doctrine of the incarnation, God is truly man and truly God. And as you say, Greg, how much did he know and when did he know it? If he had all and true knowledge, he couldn't have really been truly man. He couldn't truly have suffered all the temptations we did if he knew it all from the beginning and how it was all going to play out. So sometimes we're not comfortable from our perspective with how human Jesus may have been.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I saw an interesting article written by art historians that showed the evolution of how people viewed Jesus as the church developed in the early centuries. He went from shepherd and common person to king and halos and armies of angels. I mean, it just kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Think of meeting in a mud hut for Eucharist, and think of meeting in St. Peter's.
Yeah.
Over the course of time, there became such a parallel with the grandiose, powerful, earthly kind of thing that Jesus really didn't have anything to do with, if in fact there's truth in these pages. you know, one has to wonder how Jesus would, and I love the big, beautiful, gorgeous cathedrals, but how would Jesus really have felt
Mhm.
for the church to have developed as it did? And portraying Jesus now as like conquering king, you know.
That's one of the Indiana Jones I always think of. I can't remember which one it was, but where at the end they have to pick the chalice, and the one guy picks like
The Holy Grail.
the Holy Grail. Yeah, Indiana Jones and the Holy Grail. One picks the gold one, and they're like, clearly this is it. And he drinks and dies. And then the other one picks the one with the jewels, and finally somebody's like, dude, he's a carpenter. Picks like a plain wooden, like splintered one. Sorry if I'm ruining
Yeah.
Indiana Jones for you, but it's
No,
time
it's
you
okay.
watch that.
Right.
film.
Not only was he a carpenter, but none of the Jews owned that kind of stuff. They were.
Well, and that's
too poor.
why, like, I liked the movie,
Yeah.
but I like that, you know, Jesus, this is clearly, you
Yeah,
know.
exactly.
And then the one guy was like, carpenter, plain wood cut, got it, you
Yeah.
know.
Yeah.
He wasn't
Yeah,
cathedral.
Right.
right.
Richard Rohr,
Yes.
has some interesting, ideas on this, and he says that the same, Jesus, formed two different, roles. When he was on earth incarnated, he was in Jesus of Nazareth.
Mhm.
When he was dead and resurrected, then he once again became what he calls the cosmic Christ. But Jesus gave that cosmic Christ thing up when he became incarnated in order to show us, you know, what he wanted us to be. He became like us so that he could suffer and understand us and show us that he really did care, and he suffered and he experienced what we did. And he gave all that up. He limited himself in so many ways. Then after his resurrection, you know, his death and resurrection, then he could become the cosmic Christ again. But Jesus is Jesus of Nazareth as a man in a time and a place. It's difficult for us to comprehend. Some people struggle with the concept, you know, of how true it is or whatever. But regardless, this is the way it's portrayed through the story, that, you know, we need to take seriously the fact that Jesus wasn't somehow just play acting. He wasn't just Clark Kent, but he was literally a person who had doubts and fears and temptations and pain and
Yeah.
compassion, all those emotions that we don't normally actually really associate with God. We kind of see God as somehow distant and kind of remotely in a benign way loves us. But no, Jesus shows us the passion of God, that he was willing, God himself was willing to suffer for us and to show just how much he loved us.
Go back to Peter just for the last couple minutes, real quick. I think it's interesting that Jesus told Peter, you're going to do this. They didn't say, and you shouldn't, and that's gonna be bad. He's just like, and then Peter does it, and Peter's weeping. And it's sort of, it's not that he's done, I mean, he's not done something good, but it's just like, he's been shown what he's like. And
Well,
we talk about therapy sometimes in here, and it's sort of like, this is what you're like. And he's got to know we've got to know what we're like. Peter's got to know what he's like in order for anything to then progress. And I just feel like this is just a really beautiful, like, and Jesus is not like, and I'll hate you forever,
Right.
or
He didn't
don't
say
do
in a
it. You
judgmental
better
way.
not. Like, you'll be condemned if you do deny me. He's like, Peter,
Right.
this is what you're gonna do.
we talked about
Yeah.
this
It's
exactly in adult forum at one point. Disgustingly, this exact thing has happened in school shootings. And kids are asked, and I can't think of what, because there's so many right now, but high schoolers have been asked to profess their faith, and when they say they believe in God, they're being killed. Not in every shooting, but if
Right.
I can think of the school. So one of the things we talked about too are, you know, willing to give up your life. Does God expect that from us
Mhm.
and our children?
Mhm.
Children are being put in this And it's not just Christians, there's been so many school shootings and and this exactly, Jesus said, you're gonna do it. And
Yeah,
that was it. He didn't, and I think understanding that, and that was it.
Well, Richard
Did
Rohr
you-
calls it getting in touch with the shadow self. The
Mhm.
fact that you've got to understand what you are in all your weaknesses and all your doubts before you can understand what your potential is and what God intends us to be. And
Peter just walked right through that, not in the easiest way, in the tough way.
Mhm.
you can't really grow, you can't really become until you go through and come to terms with what, the negative, the dark side. Yeah. So
But I don't think, in some situations, I don't think denying you're Christian is a dark side. I think when we're putting high schooler kids in a life or death situation of denying or having the possibility to live, I don't think that's a dark side. I don't think, you know what I mean? Like, I don't even think it's a matter of knowing who you are. I think it's just what you're willing to live for in certain situations, but not who you are. Just what are you willing to not even live for, to die for?
Mhm.
Is your faith one that it doesn't deny your faith in any way. It just says, you know what, Carol? None of your damn business.
Mhm.
Do you know what I mean? It's not,
Yeah,
You
I guess
know-
I was thinking not just so much like denying Jesus was the bad thing.
Yep.
It was that Peter's like, I wouldn't do this. And he's like, under the right circumstances.
well, and I
you
think
might,
it's,
man.
yeah, you might
Yeah, like,
denying your willingness.
yeah, like, and it's not even so much that the denying part was that bad. I guess the way I was thinking of it is like, Peter saw himself one way, and Jesus is like, that's not really who you are. And then
And
Peter
not
got
only that, but it affirmed that Jesus knew what was gonna happen.
right.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Kind of like Peter was a deer in the headlights, you always wonder, why doesn't that stupid deer just run?
Yeah.
Get out of the
He was not
way.
in a good psychological place.
Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah.
Want to be sensitive to everyone's time. I know people have things to do after this, but
Good ending point anyway.
and we got
Yeah.
through 26,
Yeah.
so yay for us. But I'll be here
We're
next week.
almost there.
There's no, I mean, it's the journey, not the destination.
Mhm.
Yeah, right.
No, I'd
Right.
rather talk about
True.
it than read it. I can read it at home, you know?
Yeah.
Anything before we close for the day?
No.
Going once, twice? All right.
Stay
Well, thank
safe,
you.
everyone.
All right, you too, Dawn. It's good to hear you.
Yeah,
All right,
Good to hear you too.
bye now.
bye.